So, welcome everybody for this very important conversation on India's caste crisis, its global manifestations, and its gender impact. I'm not going to say much except a huge thank you to both Thenmozhi Soundararajan and Shireen Azam on behalf of the Oxford South Asian Society. I'm going to hand over to Shireen to moderate the rest of the session, of course. But before I do that, let me briefly introduce her to all of you. Shireen Azam is a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford and also a member of the Oxford South Asian Society. And before her DPhil stint began, she was a freelance writer and was an editor at EPW Bombay. So we're delighted to have you moderating this session, Shireen, and over to you.
Thank you, Gayatri. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the Oxford South Asian Society here today. I'm Shireen. Our event will run for an hour. I will request all of you to please put your microphones on mute, though you're very welcome to keep your videos on if you like. Uh, 5 months ago in Hathras, district of Uttar Pradesh, four upper caste Thakur men brutally raped and killed a 19-year-old Dalit girl. She was denied medical treatment for days, and after she died, her body was quickly and forcibly cremated by the UP cops, even as her parents protested vehemently, and the national media was right there live streaming it. This was evidently done to destroy evidence against the men who belonged to a key caste demographic in Uttar Pradesh, the Thakurs. Incidentally, also the caste of the current Chief Minister of UP, Ajay Bisht, or as he's better known, Yogi Adityanath. What is also striking is that earlier this month in court, the advocate representing all four accused argued that it was not possible for his client to have raped the girl, not because it was wrong to rape the girl, but because, and I quote, according to Indian culture, it is simply not possible for a nephew to rape a woman in front of his uncles, especially during the day when they can all see each other. As per our culture, a man will not rape a woman if his relatives are around. Hence, Ramu, Ravi, and Sandeep are innocent. End quote. For another accused, Love Kush, also an upper caste Thakur, the lawyer attempted to prove his innocence by arguing that his mother was nearby. I quote, "Why will a son rape a woman when his mother is close by? Like I said, this is against Indian culture." End quote. The invocation of Indian culture here to defend oneself from a caste based crime is quite pertinent, seeing that the oppressor, even in their defense, would rather invoke Indian culture than the basic humanity of a Dalit woman. It is not enough for us to understand violence against women in India, especially violence against lower caste women in India, as the doing of patriarchy alone. Even as news media often covers these headlines as the rape of vulnerable Dalit women, centering Dalits as the one who carry caste and the violence, we must turn our gaze at the ones who uphold this structure. How does the upper caste state come together with upper caste men to create this impunity for caste-based sexual violence in India? How does Indian culture, which is arguably just caste culture, protect this violence? How are many of us in our caste blindness and our avowed castelessness complicit in this? Um, we are very privileged to have Thenmozhi Soundararajan with us today to speak on the crisis of caste and its gender effects. Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a Dalit American transmedia artist and activist and the founder and executive director of Equality Labs, a civil rights organization working in the US and South Asia. Welcome, Thenmozhi. Um, the event will go on thus. Thenmozhi will speak for around 15 to 20 minutes, and I will moderate for around 20 minutes, after which we will take questions. If you have any questions, meanwhile, please feel free to type it out in the chat. And please, again, keep your microphones on mute. Over to you, Thenmozhi. Really looking forward to hear from you.
Sure. J Beam and J Savitri, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be able to have this conversation today. It is so deeply urgent and one that I think that we keep having, but not in a way that allows us to really move past the violence. And so I think some of, usually for my talks, like I'll have like a very structured PowerPoint because, like many Dalits, like often feel like, well, if we just explained it, if it was just about facts, we'd be able to get to the other side of this problem. And that really defined so much of like my earlier organizing. I was like obsessed with evidence collection. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a community-based researcher and did the survey related to caste in the United States, because my experience as a young Dalit was that you are constantly gaslit about the incredible amount of atrocity that you lived through under caste apartheid. And so, like any rational human being, you think, well, maybe people don't know. It's actually because they don't know. So, you write all these like earnest reports, you collect all these data sets, and you think a spreadsheet is going to free us from centuries of oppression, right? And I bring this up also to you guys as people who are knowledge producers of South Asia at a time when South Asia as a whole category is, basically imploding with the pressures of genocide internally, right? And so I think in my journey, as I watched impunity just unweave itself over and over and over and over and over again, I joined centuries of other Dalits and caste oppressed people who realize this is not a problem about evidence. This isn't a problem about like a lack of sufficient political education. This isn't even like a problem of like, not having sufficient political theory, right? We actually have brilliant writers who've been writing about this for centuries. We have, and when you think about the process of caste abolition, we've had so many phases where people have tried to fight caste apartheid, We have the rise of shamanic traditions and Buddhism and Sikhism and Jainism as a result to try to challenge this in like the religious terms. We've also seen the democratization of faiths, which is like how we saw all of the vernacular languages coming out of people wanting to remove practice of religion from Sanskrit into local languages. We also have seen like the incredible Adi movements, in the early 1900s that created a Dalit Bahujan understanding of nationalism as a response to Hindu nationalism and even Brahminical nationalism that created, an idea of India that, was supposedly casteless, but it was actually quite casted. And in all of those like iterations of, caste abolition, brilliant thinking was done. Brilliant articulations of resistance occurred, and I think about Ayan Kali and some of the abolitionist thinking he had in terms of how to deal with violent judicial systems that would not address, caste atrocity in Kerala, and how he's like, well, we'll create our own separate courts. We will try our own processes of atrocity because, again, they're not listening to us. And here we are in 2021, and they're still not listening. So at a certain point, we have to understand that caste apartheid persists, not because of, a cognitive reason, but actually a deeper reason. And it really has to do a lot, I think, with the trauma of caste and how when we are, part of a system as violent as caste apartheid, there is an experience that those who are caste oppressed have around how violent and traumatic it is. And there's also the training of the nervous systems of people who are from caste privilege backgrounds about how they understand what they need to do in order to maintain complicit relationships, in order to maintain privilege. And that's a very distinct and very different approach to understand the crisis of caste, because then we're not like going into all of the tropes that we're all, familiar with, which is that Dalit woman was raped here, or massacre occurred here, or we don't know how it happened, but someone was lynched. Oh, okay. And the fact that there's no structural connection between all of these issues is because, again, the Savarna gaze occludes itself from structural accountability. But when we go into why, we actually start to understand how discomfort governs our ability to even have this conversation, and how taboo it is often for Dalit people to even just be able to speak our truth, let alone force accountability to the removal of this violence. And I want to, give you like an example. Well, I remember when we first did our survey about caste discrimination in the United States, it's now been established by our evidence and the numerous testimonies that we've brought forth on multiple different platforms. Caste exists in the United States and in the diaspora. And what's interesting is that it goes beyond class, because you see very wealthy Dalits and IT jobs experiencing caste discrimination, as we've seen in the Cisco case. But also you have terrible cases like you did in Berkeley, California, where you have landlords like the Reddy, Lucky Bali Reddy, Reddy, who, was the second largest property owner in the city of Berkeley, who basically trafficked young Dalit women to be his sex slaves, work his restaurants, and clean up his buildings. And this wasn't one woman, this wasn't two women, this was like dozens of women. Everybody saw it happen. Everybody saw it happening. And when he was brought to court, you had members of the Indian community not come out to support those Dalit women survivors. They were coming out to support that perpetrator. And to me, that sickness of seeing caste operate in the diaspora really, again, went back to me to thinking about, if we're in a conditions where we're not seeing, all of the hierarchy and the ecosystem connected to land and the feudal process of land that governs caste in the diaspora, why are Savarnas replicating this? Why are they doing this? And what is the discomfort about talking about caste? So I brought up the caste survey because, again, one of the things that was so ironic about this whole process is when we did the caste survey in 2016, first of all, nobody took it seriously because we were Dalit women doing it. So they were like, oh God, okay, what's the point of this? There's no caste here. Oh, forget about it, Then when we started to ask organizations to conduct the survey, people went into existential crisis. We had a Savarna organization tell us, if we conduct this survey, we will actually create casteism in our organization. So we're not able to even release the survey to our members, and we have to convene an emergency meeting of our board to even discuss the politics of this. That's how taboo and ridiculous people were about the discussion of caste. And yet, we were still able to proceed and get a significant enough sample set to show quantitatively that caste exists, the kinds of discrimination people faced, and that's now led to structural accountability measures like the Cisco case and others that are popping up across the country. But I think in those experiences, and I want to go back to that idea of the trauma of caste, is I always, I was really struck by when we would talk to Savarnas in the diaspora about caste, I would ask them my experience as a Dalit when I talk about this issue is people either tell me I'm lying, or people say that I'm overestimating the problem. I even had one Savarna tell me that I was being misguided and I was an ABCD, and that maybe it was a better idea to focus on the plight of the Red Indian, because caste was an internal matter, and certainly Dalits are succeeding, and so you're causing trouble where there's no trouble. And when I watched her face when she was doing it, she was so firm about what she believed. And I thought about it, I was like, how is she so deluded? Like, where does this come from? Because, and why are the experiences of Dalit people so segregated from the experiences of people who are caste privileged? And I think it's because of discomfort. And I want to just ask people, especially people here who are Savarna, when you've experienced, and to just, close your eyes or think about that, one experience you may have had related to caste that made you really uncomfortable. It could have been like an exchange amongst classmates. Maybe it was like WhatsApp messages that occurred, in your family. Maybe it had to do with like bringing home someone who was from a different caste in an intercaste relationship. But I found that in talking with Savarnas, the tension of caste discomfort was so much that rather than actually sit through the discomfort and actually say the uncomfortable, they just stayed silent, or worse yet, would pile on in trying to hide what was going on. And that discomfort is actually the opening I really want to encourage Savarnas to really explore, to be curious about it. I'm not saying that, every situation is going to require a confrontation. But however, I think we are now in a situation where Savarna discomfort has led to so many conversations not being had that we are now facing our homeland falling into genocide. Imagine if every single person of conscience that was part of a shitty WhatsApp thread where someone was saying crappy things about Indian Muslims or Dalits or Sikhs, we've all seen these crappy messages. Imagine if there had been resistance at that level while this disinformation ecosystem was being built. Where would we be instead of talking about India being on the crisis of a genocide? And that's why this question of discomfort is so critical in the ways that we want to rewire our nervous systems for liberation, not for complicity. Because I think that there's a really deep opening and a real call to action for people of conscience to basically do everything that we can to operate with deep non-attachment, to let go of anything that is not useful to us in the path of liberation and to end caste apartheid. And the urgency that is on us for our generation is that if we don't do this, we are going to see concentration camps built on our watch. And I think about that every single day. I think about the fact that, like in the United States, while we, dodged a bullet and got Biden back into office, and the country's on its way to trying to put itself back together again, there's still extremists everywhere. You still have, crazy white people with guns marching in front of, BIPOC leaders' houses, but we still have a fighting chance, right? And even as we start to get the vaccines in the United States, you will start to see people create and reknit different ways to be together. That's not the case for what's going to happen in India. The more India gets its vaccines, we're going to go right back to where we were in 2019 when we saw the Citizenship Amendment Act really create the horizon of genocide. And now we'll just launch right back into that crazy endeavor unabated. And so I think that's why we have to do things differently. And I know that it can feel so difficult to feel, what can I do? How can I be that one individual when the forces we're up against are so total, right? We are dealing with an authoritarian environment right now, right? The fact that we saw a 19-year-old being remanded in the middle of the night for, editing 2 lines in a Google Doc is bananas. And yet, there has never been a moment in history that wasn't so dark that someone didn't show up to be a light. And I think that's really the responsibility we have. There's lots of ways to be the light and to be a force for collective resistance and resilience, and to not allow a genocide to happen under our watch. And I think that's why I want to encourage people to address the crisis of caste by confronting the pain of that discomfort. Because to be honest, this cannot be the work of Dalit peoples. I have been that Dalit person. I'm sure there are Dalit people on this list who are coming into this call that have been that person. And what it does, it wears you down, because actually Savarnas don't want to listen to Dalits. I want to just give you guys this like big secret. I think people love being in proximity to Dalit knowledge, but actually people don't want to be accountable to Dalit leadership, particularly if it's going to ask people to do things they make them feel uncomfortable with. And I'm always, what we do, we have these like unlearning caste supremacy workshops. Like I have this line, okay, maybe you'll have a dinner party that's like, disrupted, maybe the sambar's on the floor and idlis are flying. But wouldn't you rather have to like mop up sambar than know that you were sitting at the table with someone who's actually part of the genocidal project? That's kind of the stark divide that we're in right now. And when we see such a deep polarization created by, people who are extremists, who are being abetted by complicit corporations, The only response to polarization is community, and to build community. And the hardest thing to do is to build community with someone who's violent and is being violent. I'm telling you, I know this is someone who's done this work. So I'm not asking you guys to step into discomfort not having done that. I have done that. And, in many ways, it also really requires a reorientation of your training, because I think, particularly with social media, a lot of people think that, the battle for caste apartheid is about performative wokeness. So if you can be the first one to move that hashtag, if you can be the first one to have that clapback, and you're moving from this point to being woker over here, but you're not doing that work in your own personal life, in your own structural relationships, the social media work doesn't matter. And in fact, all of the dynamics that we're seeing in our homelands are exacerbated by funders, thought leaders, and institutions in the diaspora. So there's a really critical venue that you all have access to be able to create conversations that look at that discomfort directly in the eye and say, we want to create something different. We want to be able to open up different possibilities of accountabilities in intercaste contexts. This means not everyone's going to be right all the time. I think in a lot of organizing, people forget, before social media, people made mistakes as organizers, they learned from each other, and they grew with each other. But I think right now, because of the focus on performative wokeness, when people make a mistake on social media, they feel like there's no other trajectory for them to grow as a leader. But I actually think for us to step into the discomfort of the violence of confronting caste and what it's done to us, how it's dehumanized us, how it's separated ourselves from each other's humanity, we can then look with clearer eyes around how we build these intercaste platforms to start to dismantle caste in all of its different trajectories. Because caste is a political project, caste is an economic project, caste is a socio-cultural project, and it's also a psychosocial project. And with all the disciplines that people might approach it, you can't do this work from just a cognitive place. You have to look at where caste lives in you. You have to see where it makes you feel awkward, uncomfortable, silences you, helps you participate with complicity, but also limits you to the possibilities of what it means to interact with someone who is caste oppressed, in a way that is authentic and also acknowledges their humanity. And I think that those are things that require slowness. And that's also another invitation I really wanted to have people consider, is that, when you start to look at caste through the lens of trauma and violence, you realize that in order to be more self-aware about your nervous system, you need to go slower. And you need to be able to not move from a rapid response place, but actually from a place of vision and structure. And that means that you might have to take time to build trust. And when you move at that speed of trust, so that you're having authentic relationships with people that allow you to build strategy, that's a very different model than getting that rapid response call saying, hey, this is happening. Can you show up? And, oh, yeah, we need to get a Dalit speaker. Does anybody know a Dalit speaker? Okay, fine, sure, let's go. And then tokenizing people, not structurally sharing power in terms of the vision and the process occurs. But more importantly, nothing structurally changes in the way that we're actually interacting with each other as South Asians. And that's why I just want to say, as tough as things are, we have an ability and an opening with the pandemic to do things different. And I think by creating movements and thinking about movements not from like a big strategic plan focus, but through a place of like intimate experiments, we can actually innovate new ways to try to approach this problem that center Dalit and caste oppressed leadership, but look at different models of power sharing that also look at opportunities to create healing around these conversations instead of extensions uh, of further kind of ostracization. And, to give you an example, like, when we heard about the new Una case earlier this week, every Dalit women's group that I was a part of, it just was like such a breathless moment, because it was like, here we are again. Here we are fucking again, and And when you read the contents of it, the fact that this person like had bottles of pesticide in order to try to get women that didn't want to be with him, and then they forced him into this process. One, it just reminded me that, again, with Brahminical patriarchy, we have to remember that Savarna privilege is rooted in rape culture, and that we do a disservice by simply talking about Dalit victimhood without talking about why Savarnas are consistently having the license to rape and do these sexual crimes. And that's a very different way to understand this problem, because then if you were to take all of these caste crimes and do an analysis of the perpetrators, you would have a much different understanding of the structural problem. Like, what is it about Thakkurs and Reddys and Gaundars that allows them to connect their relationships with land to the exploitation of the Dalit women and queer people that live on those properties? But to actually have that conversation means the people who have those last names have to actually sit with the fact, I am connected to this violence too. And that's a much, much, much harder project to look at. And I know this because in talking with people who are Patels and Reddys and Yadavs in the diaspora, in closed circles where people are working on unlearning caste supremacy, the stories start to trickle out. Oh, I was very uncomfortable when I went to my family's farm because I thought, and these are people who are like, second generation. So they're not from India. And actually they're always told that because they're not from India, they don't have a right to say things about caste. But actually, because they've been trained with a racial lens, they are able to spot structural inequity very differently than someone who is socialized in India and has become blind to caste difference. So what's interesting, I remember this one person telling me that they went back to the family's farm and they thought they were going to have this like, farm to table experience. Like literally, very precious conversation. She was like, I thought it was going to be farm to table, and I thought we were going to be, living off the land, and I would get to see my roots. And then what I saw was my cousins terrorizing the women that worked there. And then they would talk to my brother about whether or not they wanted to, go and do bad things with the women. And my brother wasn't going to do it, but I didn't know what to say because I couldn't comprehend this was also people in my family. And then I asked her, well, after that happened, did you ever have a chance to talk to your auntie and uncle about what happened? And she said, no, because we're going to be there for a whole month and I didn't want this to affect the family dynamics. And I think that's what I was so struck by. Like, if I saw someone in my family sexually harassing or setting up the conditions for gender-based violence for someone, I couldn't go and sit down and have a dinner. I couldn't go and sit down and then, have jolly fun time. The whole time would be thinking, what's happening outside my window? I couldn't do it. Like that ability to compartmentalize is not in me to be able to do. But she was already trained to do it from her caste privilege networks, because it starts very early how to silence your own signals as a human about what is fair, what is right, what is allowed. And that's the training, that's the discomfort, that's the self-awareness that I think caste oppressed people are really asking of caste privileged people to focus on, because that's why caste is still here. And I think that that's part of the thing I just really want people to think about, that this is no longer a problem of a lack of intellectual work around this issue. It is so deeply personal to how people are now the stalwarts of holding this process in place. And so I think it's very, very important that we start to behave differently and do this work collectively so that we can work to end this in our lifetime. And the last thing that I would just say, before we go into questions, because I'm just conscious of the time, because I know we want to have time for Q&A and discussion, is that there are lots of opportunities to think about campaigns to support this issue. There are always going to be accountability campaigns to pressure for justice of victims that are coming forward. I also think that in a time of when we are seeing a genocidal horizon for our homeland, it is very important to find ways to call for accountability and to create different models of nationalism and that are not rooted in caste apartheid and Brahminical patriarchy. I also think it's really incredibly important to look at the ways that we can create legal protections related to caste wherever we might be. And, we've seen like some amazing ground won by students and workers in the United States, where people are asking for caste as a protected category in the list of their departments and their schools. And so this might be like one wonderful opening to think about, like, how can we be able to find ways to establish a rule of law that will allow for accountability related to caste everywhere in the world? Because whether or not the Indian government implements the rule of law towards Dalit people, Dalits are part of an international movement to ask for freedom from caste apartheid. And so any step forward to the recognition of the violence of this system and the recognition of our demand for dignity and power, that is a win and one of the clearest asks that we can have for allies at this time. So I'll toss it to you guys back for Q&A, so we have some time to get into discussions. So thank you.
Thank you, Thenmozhi. That was so moving and enlightening at the same time. I'll just start it off by, I want to unpack this idea of the Savarna comfort you spoke about. Is there anything in the way we are taught culture, we are taught respect towards our parents, towards our family? Is there anything in the way we are taught love that makes us so easy to be silent?
Well, I mean, I think what you have to think about is how are you raised about thinking about who is valuable and who is not. I think those are all the indicators that kind of see where you've been socialized to perpetuate Brahminical patriarchy. So I'll give you like a couple of examples that just come to mind from your question. Like, for example, like, as someone who grew up in the US, like Tamil is my second language. And I understand Tamil quite a bit, but I'm not like, a fluent speaker. But, I remember when I got my period, my mom would tell me, oh yeah, in Tamil, we say our period, we say period as Vitakaduram. And so I thought that was just the word for period. So I would say when I was talking to Tamil people, oh yeah, Vitakaduram, whatever. It was only later when I was in India and I was talking with Tamil activists, and they were talking about how the word for pollution in Tamil is titu. And it's the same word that you use for untouchability and also for women during their period. And that's why they call the period moment as Vitakaduram, which means distance from the house. So imagine you're being socialized about something that's a core function in your body, that it's polluting, it's disgusting, and the very term for that biological function is to be distanced from the house. That's just one example of how we're socialized. Like for a lot of people who I know grow up in Savarna homes, they're also used to having domestic labor, sometimes even having children. I think that is the biggest mindfuck you can ever have. Being like a child and having a child servant that is expected to play with you, that is expected to help you wash, but when they eat, they don't eat at the table, they eat at the floor. And they may not even be given fresh food, they're given leftover foods. What does that train you to do when they are your playmate, but they are also your servant? How many Indian families have you seen do that? There doesn't have to be a single articulation of here's the caste system, here are the varnas, here's your dharma related to caste. You just learn everything about who gets to sit at the table and who doesn't. And that it's acceptable. right? And also this thing about sexual violence. Like again, I really find the context of how much land and the feudal ownership of land plays a role into caste dynamics as really critical for us understanding how normalized caste violence is. There are parts of Tamil Nadu when if you are an agricultural worker and you get married to someone else who's also an agricultural worker, it is a known practice that the first person you sleep with is not your husband, but the landlord, and that the men in the family know not to enter the house if you see the landlord's chappals in front of your house because he has to have license with you. Again, there's not a single text or book that's telling you this caste is this or that caste is that. You know it by the patterns and socializations of violence. And so I think that's actually one of the hard pieces of it, is that every caste is going to have a different understanding of its privilege, and the discomfort is really what I'm saying is really for you to just start to look at your life more through a slower lens and think about every interaction and see, does this contribute to caste apartheid in some way? Is it because of like the goods that I'm buying? Is it about interactions I'm seeing in my family? Is it the stories that are being told to me or the younger children? I have a podcast with First Post called Caste in the United States. And what's unique about this podcast is that it interviews people who are Dalit and caste oppressed, but it also interviews people who are Brahmin and caste privileged. And what's so weird about it is that I was just curious, like, what makes a Brahmin a Brahmin, you know? I mean, like, do you get some special sauce? You know, I know you have like the sacred thread, but is there special sauce? Like, do you have a special sweet? Like, what's going on here, right? And I remember talking to Shambhu, who was one of the subjects for it, and he was just saying like how like being a Brahmin is like being told you're a superhero. Like from the beginning, especially if you're like a Brahmin, boy, you were told that you were above everybody no matter what. And everything that you're groomed for is for that sanctum sanctorum inside the temple. And so that's why you do all the mantras and all the purification, and you buy into it, because who doesn't want to be a superhero? Who doesn't want to live that life? Like, yeah, I'm special. Of course I'm set to win. And then he had this like very interesting awareness where, after he left his family's home and he started to be in more intercaste relationships, when he went to the temple and he went into the sanctum sanctorum, he had to leave his friends behind. And then he realized that the sanctum sanctorum was so empty because even though he was allowed to be there, everything he cared about was outside. And that was why he decided to shed the thread and to let it go, because it was just smoke and mirrors. And that was like another story that came out of that podcast was, this other, Brahmin engineer who is really brilliant. And she was talking about growing up as like a girl amongst a lot of brothers. And she was saying it was confusing being raised as a Brahmin girl, because she would be told all these great things about Brahmin boys, but she herself would be neglected. And all of this language was in the language of care. So her grandmother would like hold her and tell her all these things and would be touching and caressing her. So these are all very loving moments. And at the same time, she's being told about what her role is to be a Brahmin woman, and Sita being an example. And she was like thinking as a little kid, why do I want to go into fire? That seems so dumb. And in some ways, as children, we really do get things that like oppression is dumb. It's not fair to be unequal, and it feels gross. But the way that we're socialized to override those instincts where we can see the humanity of other people, that is the socialization of caste. And it's the numbing. Like as soon as you start to override, like as soon as someone says, well, it doesn't feel right to me, but someone who cares about me said it and this seems right, I'm just going to stop listening to myself and override my own instincts. That's that piece that then starts to help you become that brick in the wall of caste apartheid. And then you're taught any touching of that wall brings you discomfort. And I think that's what we have to pay attention to. Is that wall actually that permanent? Not really. Is the world going to end if people are upset at a dinner? No. If anything, they'll probably, Desi families, like sambar can be spilled, idlis can be thrown, they're still going to call you. And even if they don't, you know that you at least did the right thing as someone of the person of moral courage. What I worry about is that we're still having this conversation about Savarna discomfort when we have millions of people in concentration camps in India. What are we going to say when that happens? Are we all just going to be, yeah, it was like really, your children are going to ask, like, what were you doing, parents, like when, concentration camps are happening? Well, I was in my feels. I was in my feels, guys. Like, I'm sorry. It was just really uncomfortable. I was worried that someone would block me on WhatsApp. Block me on WhatsApp, for fucking sake. Do you know what I mean? Like, what is the fear of discomfort and conflict? And I think that the fear of discomfort and conflict really comes from how we've been trained to be socialized, to feel afraid in Brahminical patriarchy, to have critical analysis, to question dominant forms of culture and thinking, and to also feel like we cannot have difference safely with our family members and friends. Because so much of Brahminical thinking is about an iron fist of thought that doesn't allow for questioning and critical analysis. So for us to be able to bring that to the table is inherently in bedcray. We are trying to create consent and conversations that normally aren't allowed. And especially if you're someone who is a woman or trans or non-binary, it's already hard because you may have had those struggles about coming out with your family already. But I guarantee you, it's still going to be easier for you to have this conversation than it is for a Dalit person that's not related to you. 100%. And at this point, we don't have any more give. We don't have any more space. The horizon of concentration camps are being built right now. So if we don't act at this moment, we will have to respond to the generations that come after us that said, where were you? And I really want that answer not to be, I was afraid of getting blocked on WhatsApp, but we can just let that go.
Thank you. A lot of us listening in, I'm sure, are students, and I'm speaking from the platform of an international university, probably one of the most elite universities in the world, and with its own twisted history. But most people who end up coming here are the most traditionally privileged, from South Asia, and arguably like upper caste. And I want to talk about what sells for Indian culture in these universities. So I remember I was earlier in a university in the Netherlands, and going for a Diwali night and being shown on this, huge screen, the most uncritical and patriarchal rendition of the Ramayana. And that is shown to so many people, and many of whom are not even Indians, who have come there to learn about Indian culture and perhaps even be sensitive to our diversity. And this is what passes off as Indian culture in diaspora, the most caste oppressive practices. What does this mean, especially as we also increasingly talk about decolonization of knowledge, which is also something we obviously need. But while it's very common to hear Indian students say things like, oh, British Museum, it's anyway all stolen. Well, they stole it from our ancestors. And that's true. But what is also true is that it's not your stolen wealth. Also, it's wealth that the laboring castes of India has created, and which your ancestors and my ancestors have also stolen, and the upper castes have been exploiting lower castes for ages now. So, what I really want to ask is in the absence of many Dalit or Bahujan voices in these elite university spaces, how do we strive for decolonization with like a non-upper caste sensibility? And how have you done this in your work so far?
Well, I think one of the things is I think we need to have clarity of terms. So for me, I always say that decolonization for the South Asian context actually begins with de-Brahmanization, right? And de-Brahmanization is an entire project that has to look at the way that knowledge production has been dominated by Brahmin and dominant castes, and that it is a process that takes first both self-awareness and also metrics related to how much needs to be de-Brahmanized, and then to see transfer of power and sharing of strategies and processes towards that. Because again, you're right. It is actually a tactic of extremists to focus really heavily on the decolonial project, because it's much easier to do that. Because again, it's uncomfortable to think about where you might have been an oppressor, but it's really easy to carry the wound of white supremacy. And that's not to say that colonialism wasn't bad. It was a horrific experience. It was a generational event that created incredible trauma for hundreds of millions of um, our grandfathers and great grandparents, that had to deal with it. And for Dalit peoples, you know, Brahminization was the worst thing that could have ever happened to our people. And it's been a scourge for centuries. And it's very telling to me is that the scholars that were South Asian around decolonization, you know, never once entered or named the word or talked about the idea of de-Brahminization. That idea has really only come from Dalit scholars and Dalit Bahujan scholarship as a whole. So I think that committing to a de-Brahminization practice, which can look at, again, I think some positive ways to doing that would be getting caste as a protected category. Two, thinking about ways to build scholarships to create more caste equitable student compositions for universities, seeing if there are ways to lift up the scholarship of, Dalit Bahujan scholars in the creation of syllabuses or the teaching of classes or in the development of reading groups. And also thinking about things not just from a reactionary place, but a visionary place. Like one of the things I always think about with South Asian studies is that, if you do a caste analysis of South Asian studies overall, like globally, you'll see that the caste composition of those departments do not reflect at all the actual caste composition of our homelands. And so being able to advocate for more faculty positions or diversity that takes into account caste and religious minorities, we can have more authentic representation of those points of view, which actually assists in the process of de-Brahminization. But I think that, like, I think we have to kind of distinguish that, there are people who generally are angry about, white supremacy, and there are people who are extremists who are using this as a political project to distract from their other journeys. And so you just have to kind of know who you're dealing with, because those tactics require how authentic of a conversation you're going to be. Because if they're the extremist actors, they don't really care. They're not going to listen to Brahminization, because for them it's more important to talk about how they're aggrieved, and therefore they need to like fight for their victimhood in the particular way that they're going to do, which includes putting people into concentration camps. So you just have to kind of distinguish how that journey will go, because that same idea of decolonization will be weaponized against Indian minorities. So for example, I'm Dalit, and a lot of the social media hate will say, I'm a Christian, I'm a sepoy, I'm a rice bag. And what's really funny is I'm Buddhist. So I think it's hilarious when people will say that. But I didn't even know these terms until I was insulted by them as a Dalit woman. So I learned Christian could be written as Xin. And I remember asking my mom, I was like, Mom, what's a sepoy? Like, why am I being called a sepoy? I literally just tweeted about the UN meeting about caste issues. And then I learned a sepoy was a British trader, right? So the argument being, anyone that talks about caste is a betrayer to Indian nationalhood. So that's why I think that we have to be very skeptical about people who talk about the decolonial project without talking about de-Brahminization, because they'll weaponize it against Indian Muslims, Indian Christians, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in. I'll try to kind of sum it up as quickly as I can. But if something kind of pops in your mind, right? The Sikh Archive handle asks, to what extent does the institution of marriage reinforce caste in the diaspora? especially amongst those who insist on being anti-caste. And I'll just like to add a bit to also ask, how does how does caste play out in the diaspora apart from the obvious instances of violence? How does it play out in love and desire? Perhaps there's not, I mean, I'm sure there are enough cases of obvious discriminations, but how does it also play out in more quote unquote subtler forms in love and desire?
Um, that is a great question that I'm going to look up for you right now from our survey. But I think what's so interesting is that, so I think that caste is so funny in the diaspora because you just see it pop up in the most stupidest places, and there's no reason for it to do that, right? And so when it comes to like marriage, for example, we see that, first of all, people who are like woker than woke still feel uncomfortable telling their families that they don't want to marry someone who's not an Iyer or someone who's not a Reddy. That's why you have tons of people that go to these cruises. I don't know if they have this in the UK, but they have this in the US. They have cruises that are designed to be singles cruises for castes. So you can go on a Reddy cruise and meet other single Reddys who are ready to get married, no pun intended. But can you imagine, like, you have people that have grown up in the United States that are going on a Reddy cruise and are openly doing this process, and it's like bizarre. And there's lots of things that are like this. There's like, the Brahmin Samaj of North America, and yes, there is a Brahmin Samaj of North America. They have a single sites for Brahmins to meet each other that are trying to be able to meet up. And again, like, I just think that if we, when you think about the prohibition of travel, right, typically dominant caste people were forbidden to travel the Kalapani because you would lose your caste affiliation because of the connection to the land. That's why so many of the first caste immigrants in the diaspora were actually Sikh. They were, or people from Bahujan backgrounds, because dominant caste, and certainly Brahmins, did not want to travel and risk that. But what's so interesting is that the area of marriage and relationships is often the place where you see so much violence, and it's the place where people just sheepishly give up. So we had something like, I think the statistic was like 40% of Dalits and caste oppressed people had said in the United States that they had experienced a breakup related to caste, related to caste background, some of their caste background. And some of the stories you hear, they're just really sad. Like, I remember talking to this one social worker who was Dalit. And, he was just sharing with me, this really intense story about, an intercaste couple that had a baby. And they had to give up the baby, because they didn't see that they would have a future, you know. And you'd be surprised, like, I think that people experiment with intercaste relationships in the diaspora, but when it actually comes to like settling down and dealing with family related to it, that's where people often don't want to deal with it. And then the result is that if you are a child of an intercaste marriage, because there's so little conversation about the realm of the psychosocial of caste, most intercaste children don't have all the tools to understand what are they seeing in their families, like what is the trauma related to this, what is the violence that's happening from this. And all of this happening in the background when we're seeing conversations like love jihad, where we're seeing like interfaith couples being being targeted by the state, and the honor killings that we've seen related to intercaste relationships. The fact that people are trying this but still failing shows how much we have to do as a community to really address the psychosocial aspects of caste apartheid.
Thank you. I know we're almost reaching the end of the session, but if you're happy to take a couple of questions, I'd like to kind of address.
Oh, sure. I'm fine. I have a little bit more time to worry.
Great. So Shivani asks about private universities in India, which do not practice the reservation system and thus have a large number of urban Savarna students. And so Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi students often fear to speak out on caste issues and thus get silenced. She asks, in this scenario, how should a Savarna student stand with the DBA students to hold this conversation? And what are the precautions that should be taken by Savarna students?
Well, I always think that this is like a really interesting question because, so often like we're in rapid response mode, right? So it's like something happens, we have to move in this quick modus. There's no structural power that is really had. So oftentimes the result is like kind of a Pyrrhic victory where you win something, but there's been so much energy lost. And also all the people involved are still in an even more precarious state, right? And, I think we still need to have those rapid response battles, but I also think we need to start getting strategic. I think if there is like a growing mass of people that have power on a campus, one thing I would recommend is like really thinking about, pushing the administration to creating, if not direct reservation, services to support caste oppressed students. That could include like coaching. It could include, supports for more scholarship. Maybe, this, I think one of the reasons why you have so many Ambedkar Periyar study circles is because people are trying to create cultures of support and solidarity. So there's other safe people can meet with. So trying to solve this structurally and also trying to solve it, as opposed to in response to a negative action, but rather looking towards solving the structural might be one. But there's no way to get around that it's deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And in many ways, it has to be solved from the top. It has to be solved from like a policy level. And policy work like that is really hard right now, given the context.
We have a question from Zahra Kasmi, who talks about the hopelessness one feels when faced with such a powerful project, which you called the Genocidal Horizon, where Dalits, Muslims, Sikhs, farmers, activists, students, and women are all branded traitors to a Hindu Brahminical supremacy project. She asks, what tangible possibilities do you see when it comes to defeating something so powerful? One often feels hopeless, and I would be curious to know if you see tangible possibilities for resistance in the political sphere.
So I think that it is really hard to build hope, particularly if you're from one of the communities that's facing the barrel of the gun. That's just hard. And I think having compassion for yourself and the other people that that might be in that same situation is like a really important start. And I think the thing that gives me the engine and the drive to be able to continue in the face of this like punishing violence is the fact that I know that our ancestors actually suffered so much more. And that in some ways, when we are facing generational level crises, like if you think about in this last year, we had a pandemic, we had genocide, now we have the farmers' protests, and it just keeps going, like all the chaos that's happening, right? When you have those big structural kind of challenges, it's really easy to get lost in your day-to-day life and processes, because these genocidal projects are all about also extinguishing our ability to be able to create resistance, extinguishing our hope. And I think one of the things that I always say, when faced with this, is that no matter what's happening, I choose life. I choose life. And life is the only appropriate response to a project of death. And that animating, moral truth, I think can open up lots of different ways to help reignite hope in the way that you find and build resilience. And sometimes, especially when things are in a really dark place, we may not be able to go toe to toe with violent actors in the ways that you want to. Maybe it will take a while for us to build the power and resistance that's required. But, if anything that the farmers' protest told us is that basically every Republic Day, you are going to see fireworks from people across the country who are tired of being under Brahminical domination. Whether it was, 3 years ago, Bhima Koregan, or 2 years ago, the Citizenship Amendment Act, or now the farmers' protest, more and more people realize how violent it is to be around these people that really don't care for anything except for themselves. And with South Asia, we have the crisis of genocide and the crisis of climate change. And those are two very devastating, overwhelming things to hold. And yet, I can tell you, there has never been a people that are as poised as ourselves to be resilient in the face of these incredibly violent experiences, because we have survived so much before. So I think one thing that's really critical is to really go back to, whatever practice you have, and this is not the political strategy question that you asked, but, and I can get to that, but I mostly wanted to say that as people who are fighting on the front lines, as people who are resisting with every means of breath that you have to do something to nourish yourself to be able to keep fighting forward. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And the adversaries in this context are actually very well funded and relentless. And so to be prepared for that, you need to choose life in yourself, choose like one thing that you do to build joy, as well as with purpose, resist this violent process. And it can feel hard. Like, we're seeing people jailed everywhere. We are seeing like many, many sick organizations in the last couple of weeks being targeted relentlessly for being extremist actors, simply for saying we want to support the rights of farmers over the rights of corporations and, a corrupt government. And the amount of people that stood up and are listening is getting larger and larger and larger. And every time we fight, we get stronger. But we have to acknowledge that we are fighting with tears in our eyes, and that there's so many activists that I talk to who, whatever their public experience is, at home late at night, they're crying, they're grieving, they're confronting questions of suicide, they're wondering if there's a way forward. And I want to say, as someone who has talked to all those people, there are ways forward. We are going to get through this, and we're going to get through this because we have each other. We are going to get through this. We are going to be together, because fundamentally, every time Brahmanism has tried to come up with its newest scheme for a generation, guess what? Dalit Bahujans and our allies basically shut that shit down. So it's happening. It's occurring right now as we're speaking. But we can't allow them to discourage us from the power that we are fighting for just because they believe their own hype. And frankly, you have to think about the fact that, like, when you are on social media, we are on complicit corporate platforms that have basically allowed the menace of the BJP IT cell to essentially terrorize all of our communities, because it makes them a shit ton of money. So sometimes when you see the things that they project about themselves, it's actually a lot larger than actual real political power. And so I think it's important to recognize we are building a number, that so much of this conversation is having at a state level, and that, when you can't win at the big macro level, focus on the micro, focus on the interpersonal, focus on the state politics, focus on what's movable, and build enough power until that starts to get contagious. And wherever we can, you don't give license to extremists. The fact is that many, many universities help to platform and legitimate a lot of these genocidal ideas. So if you guys see stuff like that happening, don't give them a platform. But I want to say, it's such an honest and true thing to be struggling with hopelessness right now. A lot of people are struggling with that. And I think that just by even saying, even though some days you may not believe it, I choose life. It just might feel like the hardest day to go up, especially when you've read the 15th, message that basically says, the crappiest thing about who you are, whether you're an Indian Muslim or an Indian Dalit or, a Sikh. We do not have to take on the language of the oppressor in the generation of our moral courage to choose life. And the more of us that choose life, it is an unstoppable vision for liberation. And we are not going to let these people take our future away from us. And so that requires us to have that purpose and connection with each other, because the opposite of extremism and polarization is community.
Thank you so much, Thenmozhi. This has been like the most amazing evening, and I think many of us will go from here with a lot of rage, but also, I guess, quite a bit of hope, and that's very, very important. And I guess if there's one thing we all should take away from today is please talk to your families and raise uncomfortable conversations.